and make a difference in the world. And, you know, that's a big enough topic. I'm sure there are lots of other things we could and may well be talking about as well. If you have a question, you can put your hand up in the reaction area on the bottom, as many of you may know, or put it in the chat or comment. And let's see, what else do I want to say? Please introduce yourself in the chat so we all know who each other is. If you want to be on our mailing list and our Google group, put your email in the list. You won't get too many items, but hopefully you'll get notices of the meetings and articles and so forth. I also want to introduce the steering circle, the 5 of us who are stepping up to try to sort of, at least initially, lead this effort and guide this effort. Suzanne Reed from California, Ron Bayman from Illinois. I don't know if Aria is here, Aria McKenna from Florida. Mark Hibbert from Glasgow, who just emailed us that he's not able to be here today. I guess he's still recovering from several weeks being in Glasgow during, we understand, a meeting happened there a little while ago. And myself from the Washington, D.C. area. This will be our second speaker, or second conversation in this series. We had Professor Gernot Wagner from NYU, who's written about geoengineering 2 weeks ago. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike McCracken, who is a longtime friend and colleague of Rafe's and an eminent and experienced scientist himself. So Mike, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome Rafe here. We've been on parallel paths since sometime in the mid-'80s, or maybe early '80s. There were a whole number of problems that I think Rafe got interested in, and CO2, he was got interested in the EPA results in around 1978 or 9, when we were actually starting a program over at Department of Energy, and those programs were sort of going along parallel for a while. But there was also nuclear winter, there was also ozone depletion, there was whatever else there were, and stuff, and then climate change. What I found in looking up sort of back to when we certainly first met was that Rafe was one of the original board members of the Climate Institute, which held one of the first sort of interdisciplinary large meetings in Washington, D.C. in 1986, I think it was, when he was on the board and I was sort of coming in, I think, from the Department of Energy program, and I'm pretty sure it was then. Rafe was on for a number of years. I don't actually know how many. I've been sort of affiliated with the Climate Institute since retiring in 2002, sort of, and so he's been affiliated and around in the climate change issue for a very long time. We both have been particularly interested in the Arctic recently and how it's changing. And I think he's now currently chair of an Arctic 21 group that tries to bring people together to talk about the Arctic. And he's sort of convened a wonderful series of lectures and talks of people, when they're in the Washington, D.C. area, that I've been able to go to. Herb, you'll have to perhaps start coming to those.
Right.
If they get, once they get started. Well, they're sort of still going on, so we ought to be doing that. Yeah, Rafe has some very interesting ideas about the Arctic and was very instrumental in helping get, I think, the president, when he went up to Alaska and the Arctic Council, and getting some of that activity going, which followed the Arctic Impact Assessment Report and other things. So welcome, Rafe, and be really interested to hear your thoughts on where we are now on trying to preserve the Arctic, restore the Arctic.
A big question. Let me just start it off then with a first question to Rafe. And this letter that I alluded to that we collectively wrote, and of course, like all collective letters, we would have each have liked to have seen something slightly different in the letter, but it was something that over 40 of us from 10 countries signed. And the central ask that we bolded, I'm going to just, it's 2 sentences, I'm going to read it right now. I just want to get your reaction to it. if you were working with us 2 months ago, would you have signed a letter that had this ask in it, or do you have other thoughts on what you would have liked to have seen? So the basic ask is, we ask that COP26 adopt a resolution committing to develop a climate restoration plan no later than 2023 to limit global warming to well below 1 degree C. An effective and responsible plan will need to integrate 3 approaches. Number 1, cooling the planet, particularly the polar regions and the Himalayas. Number 2, reducing GHG emissions, including methane and other short-lived warming agents. And number 3, removing legacy CO2, methane, and other GHGs from the atmosphere. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Rafe.
Well, I'm delighted to be in front of the group that put forward the most, I want to say radical proposal, but different and bold than the conventional wisdom out there, as you read the 2 sentences. Before I get going here, I want to introduce my colleague, Gabrielle Dreyfus, who I am pleased to be working with more and more over the last few weeks, and hopefully more, who's with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. And in particular, one of the reasons that I'm glad she's here, she is a co-author of an op-ed that she and I and her president of her, Durwood Zelke, and a professor of international law, Dan Bodansky, wrote, and it came out, what's today, Thursday? It came out Tuesday in The Hill. It's sort of a bit along the lines of your two sentences, and you might have a look at it. It's again in The Hill, a newspaper. It's on the Arctic, and it was published Tuesday. Many of the ideas that I've sort of come to are sort of embedded in that. Another version of the same thing, it's a little more, was a piece I wrote with Dan Bodansky, again, one of the authors of the op-ed piece, that was published in the scientific literature a few weeks ago on the Arctic. You can find, if you just plug in Bodansky Pomerance, you'll find it. So I think our framework is similar to yours. I'll back up. Let me say a word about Arctic 21, which Mike mentioned. I'm the former chairman of it. I helped to catalyze this network. And I'll tell you the story of when it happened, because Mike probably doesn't realize this quite, but he and I were on a steering committee of a workshop at Columbia University with Stephanie Furman, who was a professor at Barnard, and others, back in 2013. And the title of this seminar was White Arctic, Blue Arctic. Can we restore sea ice? And we had about 50 people in the room, all mostly important and really smart scientists. And we kind of looked at the options, a bit like the list I don't think we were talking much at that point about carbon removal, but the main thing I remember about this was, the only way to restore sea ice in the short run is through solar radiation management. That's the only way to bring it back. I mean, that was a comment I still remember from the meeting. There's some papers that came out of it, but it was also mentioned at that meeting that the Obama administration was going to take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council shortly after our meeting, maybe 2015, 2016, or maybe the end of 2014. So it seemed an opportune time to raise the visibility of climate change in the Arctic, because at that point, in my mind, the amount of press coverage to what we came to call the unraveling of the Arctic was not substantial enough by any means, that this big story wasn't being covered. And I brought colleagues together. We formed this network called Arctic 21, And our first job was to convince the Obama administration to make climate change in the Arctic a central feature of its chairmanship, and to communicate what was going on. And that was not a terribly hard sell. Todd Stern, who was then our lead negotiator at the State Department, backed the idea. John Holdren, and of course, John Kerry was Secretary of State. John Holdren was science advisor. So people were supportive. It happened. And the U.S. went on through the chairmanship of the senior Arctic officials of Dave Bolton, who was a State Department official, who now has an important interagency job on the Arctic. The U.S. went on to do a reasonable job at bringing the situation in the Arctic to the fore. And one byproduct of this was that President Obama had his own conference in Anchorage during the chairmanship. And it was an international conference with foreign ministers, and the president went off to travel to see actually the conditions in Alaska resulting from climate change. So he brought a lot of attention to it. The Arctic Council has been, let me just say, not doing what it ought to do on climate change. Not. And I'll give you the framework that let me say, Herb, I'm happy to take interruptions, questions at any point. I'm just making some opening remarks here. I'm sort of, where I came out of this was that, and I think we articulated it at the Anchorage meeting, was a question or two questions. What is the future state of the Arctic? Question one. Question two, what is the Arctic we have to sustain the global climate system? And the point of those questions, that those are questions governments should answer. And the third part about it is, okay, how do you get there? And I think our op-ed suggests this, the one we produced this week, because it was linked to the Arctic Report Card. You all know about the Arctic Report Card that came out on Tuesday. So the Arctic Report Card has been this great piece of work every year for many years now, but we labeled the report this year as incomplete because it's incomplete unless you answer those questions. What's the future state, and what's the Arctic required to sustain the global climate system? It's an obvious question. It sits in front of it should sit in front of governments, and we also sort of urged. No, that's not the right word. We've been disappointed in the Arctic Council because it's never taken up this central question, and it's kind of a question of our time, isn't it? I mean, recognize that in the climate world, it's not just the Arctic, as we saw this week. It's the Antarctic, and the Thwaites Glacier and its ice shelf. It's the Himalayas, as you mentioned. I mean, there's a crisis I did a lot of work on coral reefs when I was at the State Department. We set up an international initiative because the reefs were bleaching. And now we know that many of the reefs in the world are dead from bleaching, and they're not going to survive on a global basis, including on the Great Barrier Reef. So, but the Arctic is representational and a reality of where we stand in the climate problem, and very obvious, the data's there, and we understand the drama. We're going to lose permafrost and get the CO2 and methane feedback. We're losing sea ice and therefore losing reflectivity. We're losing the small Arctic glaciers and Greenland. The small glaciers are going quickly. Greenland's, of course, going slowly because it's so big. So from permafrost, we get the feedback as well as the land use changes. From sea ice, we get the loss of reflectivity. From the loss of the glaciers, we get sea level rise. And my one-liner is my work as chair of Arctic 21 was that the fate of Greenland is the fate of Miami. Mm. And, my work I'm a policy person. a lobbyist, an activist. You know, one-liners are my business. Strategy and one-liners, you know.
You mentioned a name a minute or two ago that I wanted to drill down on, and that is John Kerry. So our first letter, our first effort, maybe 3 months ago, was a letter directed to John Kerry that essentially had a very similar ask, a different language, not as quite as focused as what I read to you earlier. And we made an attempt to get it to him. Whether we actually saw it, who knows? But I guess if you were in a room with John and discussed with him this strategy, this approach, the set of demands, what would he say to you, and what would we need to say, or you need to say, to convince him to be more out front and lead on this?
That's a good question. I think I wouldn't get the meeting with John Kerry, but I'll come back to that. I think that what you have to do is present a way forward for somebody like Kerry. You can't give him an impossible demand and say, do this. Only you need to think about a strategy that would work for, given the constraints that he has. And I'll give you just an example of the constraint is managing the politics of solar radiation management. It's still very controversial. You know, the government at the highest levels has not fully embraced research in this area. The politics are difficult. So you have to figure out how you get through those hoops. I mean, and to say you want a 1 degree, what do you want to do? Reduce the increase in temperature to 1 degree by when?
Well, it didn't have a date, but well below 1 degree. It was kind of paralleling well below 2 degree that we now have.
Yeah. Well,
the date was a climate restoration plan that the world would agree on to achieve this.
Well,
in 2 years.
In 2 years. Whoa. I was a State Department negotiator for 6 years. So I just think of that's a challenging thing to pull off, but you got to start with a vision and then you figure out your strategies, right? The way we have gone at, we are, Gabrielle and I and our colleagues have been talking about how you would approach this, is that you would try to sell this idea, a version of yours or ours, to key people in the government. Maybe in the media at some point, maybe on Capitol Hill. But the way that I think that I consider kind of a more, or might be a more saleable, that's the right word, approach is to say, okay, tell me what is the future state of the Arctic? What do we have to sustain a global climate system? Figure it out. And how do we get there? And our op-ed, I think, alludes to the fact, as the piece I wrote with Bodansky, that it's kind of like yours. It's probably just the same. You need all the pieces simultaneously to move forward, right? Emission reductions, carbon removal, resilience, reductions in the other greenhouse gases, particularly in methane, short-lived forcer, and the research into climate interventions, including solar radiation management, but you can include them all the ideas. The point is to put the SRM or geoengineering into this package of where it has to be considered as part of an alternative, of a comprehensive strategy that the government would evaluate in terms of reaching the goal, the kind of goal that you're enumerating. Although, you've got a very, it would be wonderful if we could get to below 1 degree soon, but it's pretty, I don't want to call it unrealistic. It's a reach. How about that? And so I've taken at times, I call the SRM stuff the two Pinatubo strategy.
Yes.
Yours sounds like it might be a 3 or 4 Pinatubo strategy, but who knows? I mean, you got to, so what would drive the consideration of all of this is a decision, in my mind. One way to think about it is to limit the unraveling of the Arctic and potentially restore it or parts of it, given where we are. And the drama of the Arctic is very apparent. So the question is, how do you make the case to evaluate what's going on and put in place? So I remember suggesting to one of my friends who's in the government now, I said, you put NASA and NOAA in charge of giving you the alternative Arctic futures. What do they look like? And then you know, what's the implication of it all? And then you bring forward, you do the analysis of what it would take using a comprehensive approach to limit the Arctic warming to the level which stops permafrost thaw, stops and maybe reverses sea ice loss, stops and slows the demise of Greenland and other glaciers. Those are some initial goals. You could talk about spring snowpack as well. So the problem that I'm trying to address in this effort was that it's very difficult to see the highest level people in the U.S. government embracing solar radiation management out front, given the politics of today. Now, your organization might be able to have a big and important effect on that because you're publicly supporting that option, which is politically fraught. It's less than it used to be. Now, just one other words. I thought the media this week on Antarctica and the Thwaites Glacier was astonishing. I mean, it's like, holy shit. Wait, this is being recorded. Game over. Game over. You know, there was some of the media, I think they got it wrong, that this ice shelf could disintegrate within 3 to 5 years, and then the Thwaites Glacier would start to collapse. You know, most of the people I know who are into Thwaites say it's 2 degrees. If you stop before 2 degrees, Thwaites will stay in place. Or that's my version of what they say. Okay, I'm going to stop right there and add one thing so we can have a discussion here. You have a steering committee member from Florida, right?
Yes.
But she's not here.
Right.
How can that be? Anyway, just kidding. I have a project.
We'll pass that on to her.
Yeah. Well, let me explain why. I have a project in Florida, which is called the Upper Limit Project. I'm working with a lot of people. So the question is, what is the upper limit of tolerable sea level rise and heat in Florida? How much sea level rise can Florida take? Okay. And well, if you say that 2 degrees means the demise of Thwaites, that's the demise of Florida. I mean, Florida, there are a lot of impacts already embedded in the future, kind of inevitable rise of the oceans now. I mean, what we're going to get, what's already baked in. But once you start out, you know, into the 2 to 3 feet, Florida will not be viable. But that number is with us today. And the point as a possibility. So the point of this is to tie Florida's climate policy to the upper limit, which drives an emissions scenario consistent with that upper limit for the state, but also provides them the platform to argue for that nationally and globally. So Florida, which is a terribly important place politically, is linked to the fate of the Arctic, right? Fate of Greenland is the fate of Miami. So you think that's kind of a strategy I've been working on for a long time, thinking that Florida is a critical geography politically. Now, just to say, Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, a former governor for 2 terms, who's now the senator, is a climate denialist. He was the entire time he was governor. DeSantis, when he announced, I mean, he's a denialist too, even though he's putting out money for resilience because many localities are demanding it. But when he did it, he sort of poo-pooed the reality of climate change. So you have the incredible fact that the leadership of the state of Florida is denying the source of its demise. I'm going to stop there because I went on for quite a while. Thanks. Discussion.
Yeah. That's another, the upper limit project is another example of your one-line brilliance there, I guess. I really like that. I'm going to call first on Robert Tulip, who put a question in the chat. Robert, who's been a long time participant in these efforts and has worked on lots of efforts involving refreezing the Arctic and other places, and hails from Australia. And then after that, Suzanne, I saw your hand after that. So go ahead, Robert.
Thanks very much, Rafe. Just picking up on your comment that only SRM can prevent Arctic ice loss. I'm wondering why you think this basic scientific observation is so comprehensively ignored by governments, by industry, by academia, media, climate activists. And do you understand this both in terms of tribal psychology underpinning the problem, and also how does it link to a strategic analysis around security, national security? Like, I think this tornado is just a classic example of potentially how the effect of the Arctic on the jet stream has set the climate haywire.
Let me see. I think there were 3 parts to that, but I might be able to remember the first one, which was, why won't people think about SRM as a legitimate way to retain sea ice? Okay. And in the short run, that's all there is. That's my conclusion, but SRM has been unmentionable in many green circles as something that's a legitimate option. It's not something that people will talk about and or support even thinking about it as an option. It's just politically a big problem, and part of the reason is that people fear it will get in the way of emission reduction strategies. Part of the people feel there's a great risk to it. Well, there is. Of course, there's risk to not using it too. And it's just a political problem on top of a scientific problem. The scientific problem is, how do we do it? What are the risks? And so on. And, and plus the geopolitical issues of how do you negotiate a global agreement to do this? So for many of us, like me as an advocate in this, trying to work around the politics of SRM has been very difficult, almost impossible. When John Holdren was the president's science advisor, his first big interview, the interviewer from AP at the end said, "Do you support research on geoengineering?" This is in the early Obama years. And Holdren said, "Of course." And he got killed in the media. He got killed as a political matter. That's a little strong. He was criticized for this. And that was the last time he talked about it, I think. So the politics have been fraught. They are less fraught than they were. And it's kind of like this week, the stories about Antarctica, it's pretty tough to deny the immediacy of the crisis of catastrophic events and take away a potential tool. So, as to national security, where I go with that is, Donald Trump, remember what he used to say about Greenland, that we ought to buy it? I said, no. I wrote an op-ed piece. Well, so I'm glad that Donald Trump is focusing on Greenland, but it's actually, the real issue is trying to keep it intact. That's where the U.S. security interests are, is in avoiding the ice sheets disintegrating, right? That's what we ought to be paying attention to. That Greenland, as you know, Greenland's the fate of Greenland's fate of Miami. That it's not just the fate of Miami, it's the fate of every coastal city in the United States and worldwide. So that's a security issue of all time right there. So maybe should I say, did I respond?
Do you see a link to the tornadoes and the jet stream?
Tornadoes, jet stream. Well, I think the discussion about tornadoes has been interesting because the attribution problem with tornadoes is difficult, right? So if I were asked by the media, what do you think about tornadoes? I say, well, we need this, the attribution people have to get at this. Now, it was an extreme event in its timing, its magnitude, its speed, its destructiveness. She said, well, there must be something special about this. All I know is I hear a lot of discussion about attribution in tornadoes, okay? Now, if you say, what about hurricanes? Well, we know the intensification of hurricanes is underway. There are more category 4s and 5s. That's kind of predicted that of the hurricanes that occur, more will be major storms. That's a different attribution problem. On the jet stream, the attribution, we know the jet stream is changing. We know it's wavier, and it appears to be wavier because of the change in the differential between the temperatures of the Arctic and mid-latitudes, which in turn causes these blocking patterns and so on. So the jet stream science and attribution is further along. And I always say that, well, if I have a question, I talk to Jennifer Francis, who's a world-class climatologist, meteorologist who studied this problem. And so the jet stream, the case can be made that the jet stream is changing because of Arctic warming and the change in. First thing I learned 40 years ago in climate change science was that the jet stream is a byproduct of the temperature differential between the latitudinal sense, right? You all know this stuff much better than I do. So I looked at Gabby, she's nodding her head means I got it right. And that's how you have a plant in the audience. She could shake her head and say, no, wrong. So I remember Wally Broker. Everybody know Wally Broker? You know, the man they say knew more about how the planet operates than anybody else. I remember him saying one of the reasons to go and look hard at solar radiation management was to restore the temperature, what's the right word? The temperature gradient in the northern hemisphere, presumably southern hemisphere. Related problem in the southern hemisphere. Here's one. The reason Thwaites is in trouble is because warm water, deep warm water is coming up under the shelf, right? Well, why is the deep water coming under the shelf? Because it changed in the circumpolar winds, right? Why is there a change in the circumpolar winds? Because of the change in temperature differential between the southern hemisphere, the equatorial regions, and the pole. That I can actually say that story. Okay, but is there a single analysis of how SRM might change the circumpolar winds in Antarctica, as far-fetched as that sounds? I don't think you can find anybody in the glacial community or the geoengineering community who's doing that analysis. I'd love to. We're not doing the right analysis. That is one of the most fundamental problems facing us. Is there anything we can do about Antarctica? So, all right, that was a good,
Okay.
that felt good. This is very therapeutic for me. Thank you.
That's right. We'll send you the bill.
Good. I'm happy to pay.
I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne for your comment or question.
Well, it's basically a follow-up to Robert's and also a reference to Rafe's point that we just had several reports on rain and loss of Greenland and everything else in the newspaper, and all share the frustration of not breaking through into the public policy arena. It's previously, and in terms of developing our strategic approach, we've talked about getting the climate change covered accurately by the media and prominently, and putting it on page one instead of a special section. But we seem to have reached a point where we are getting the coverage that we would like from nationally and internationally recognized, but we're still not breaking through into the political arena with the messaging. And I think connecting the impacts the Arctic Florida is one part of messaging, but who do we get the messaging to really break through and make people change their attitudes and make this a priority in the public policy development process? Thank you.
I would offer a word: persistence. You have to, this is year 42 or 43 for me in climate change. When I started, there was nobody out there. First guy I ran into was Mike McCracken. He was already there at DOE, but there was no public support for doing anything. So I think what you need within your letter is to pick a strategic, I'll make a suggestion here. Pick a particular strategic, pick an objective. Of all the things you enumerate, which ideas do you want to focus on? I mean, don't take the whole thing on. You take the whole thing on, but within that, pick an initiative that can be is distinct, separable, that you think is the most important thing to move forward. I'm just offering this. This is your new group. You're small. You haven't that much experience in the policy world. And then you have to put together a strategy to carry that slice of what you're advocating forward. I mean, you can have your overall picture, but what within that do you want to see happen? What are the first couple things you want to see happen? Now, I'm offering one idea, which is okay, tell me the Arctic we have to have. What is the future state of the Arctic? We demand answers to that. And we want a strategy that encompasses all the means we have to get there. But there's no answer to the future state. Nobody's answered that question. So then within that, you could say, well, if I'm suggesting that SRM is still politically politically difficult. My comment: Joe Biden would have to authorize SRM analysis as part of an Arctic salvation kind of analysis because of the politics. So you guys are connected very broadly to many smart scientists and others across the world. So how about a letter from 200 scientists that outlines this and why this has to be thought of? I'm just throwing this out. I know you got to take organizing steps that move the issue. You sent a letter to the COP, right? Well, you sent a letter to somebody else?
To some of the G20. We wrote it. We're not sure how many actually got it. It's hard to find email addresses, etc.
Well, it's a good example that you're starting out with such a great ambitions, and the probability of it being kind of effective is low. So you have to choose a more, at least I would argue, you need to be clever about how you go about making the things happen that you think need to happen. And I would say, so you want to slice it up, and then you want to think of tactics to build support for it. And it just occurred to me that you guys could probably put together a letter around SRM that says this has to be integral, because for all that we're so late. Anyway, just a thought.
No, I mean, I think that's a great response, but, and I think it's within the realm of the overall organization. One of the, the wide net, in terms of initiating the letter and gathering support for it was to have something in it for everyone, and so at the end of the day, those who are interested in various aspects of what we promoted were willing to, came to consensus on an overall package.
Okay, so what I'm suggesting, the way to do this, that is to say, do the analysis of using all these measures of what's required to achieve a sustainable state of the Arctic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Okay, so that way, what happens is everybody's in it. You don't throw anybody's strategy out. You just say, do the analysis. And part of the analysis will throw out strategies that are not viable.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. And I think it fits with the evolution of our organization to become more precise and insistent on where we want to go with this. So I really appreciate the advice.
I just want to come back to my colleague here, Gabby Dreyfus, who is, she is full-time on issues in this whole arena. And I think you might stay in touch with her. She might be willing to be helpful to you as you move forward.
I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you, Gabby. Are you shaking your head yes, or are you? Good. I think that's a yes.
We've already bonded. Gabby's a former horse person, so.
Oh, good. Well, that's super.
We got it.
Good job, Suzanne.
Okay, Rafe. What's troubling, I think, is are there good examples of where the government has been responsive to long-term issues? I mean, there are all sorts of examples where the government really isn't paying attention, whether it's Social Security or a whole bunch of other things. And the politicians don't seem to do it. One of the things that several of us are trying to do is go to where we think we might actually, the people who actually can perhaps make a difference, which is actually, recognizing the way some things work in politics is who's got the money, and try and go to the international big money management people and try and get them to be the ones who are demanding change. And what we've discovered in doing that is that we keep pitching the scientific view of things, which is sort of generally the central thing in what we really know. You were talking about, do we know about tornadoes and do we have attribution yet? But if you look at the business in the world and you look at the investment world and you look at the infrastructure planning world, they're supposed to be planning for the worst case situation or the worst plausible case situation, the 100-year flood. And so telling them to pay attention to the science is actually the wrong thing. You want to tell them to pay attention to their tradition, which is pay attention to the worst plausible thing which is the Thwaites Glacier going and having 2 or 3 feet or more of sea level rise quickly. So I guess I'm wondering how we get the political world to sort of, can scientists be the way to convey the information to the political world? Are there other ways to try and get the attention of the politicians so they really pay attention to us? Maybe we need partners in the risk community or something.
Well, it's that's been a struggle for decades, right? I just tell you a story about Florida. Its fate is on the line. We have all this media this week about Thwaites, and trying to connect those dots is a challenge. You would think that the business leadership in Florida would figure out that the fate of Thwaites is their fate, and then act upon that.
Well, the county commissioners in Florida during the last assessment, in Southern Florida at least, were serious about it.
There are a growing number of serious people in Florida. But in terms of having a vision of the kind of strategy you're outlining, it doesn't exist there. And however, the way I put this is if you're trying to, you establish an upper limit, then you have to ask how you get there. And the way you're going to get there, you're going to have to use the technologies that we're talking about here. So, you know, I wish there is an element of this when somebody asked about national security earlier.
Yeah, I mean,
well, let me just say this. We're talking about in the sea level rise area, the fate of coastal America, okay? And how you make that case in a way that then drives what has to happen is still a challenge. But I think we're, you know, that's why you have to, I mean, the way I've done this is I carved out this strategy called, I mean, my two answers, I don't think it's easy. I mean, if it was easy, we would have done it, right?
No, but then the national security community does its planning based on sort of worst plausible things. And so the US has a large military because it's worried about fighting a war, a conflict in both the Atlantic and the Pacific basins at the same time. You know, that's the basis for the military budget. It's sort of a contingency planning kind of strategy. And yet we don't do this for this response to climate. I mean, the generals and admirals have started to express that in some things, but we need to get them paying attention to the framing they are. You also said there's big uncertainty about climate engineering. I think there's much, much less uncertainty about climate engineering than about not doing it, which is just potentially disastrous. But
okay,
you're right. We keep getting said it keeps getting said SRM is really uncertain, and I think that's just.
No, I think what did I say that? We better go back to the recording and look. But what I said was it's risky. Some people think it's risky. It's also risky not to use it.
Yeah, and I think it's more risky not to use it.
That's good. That's fine. I like to hear that.
All right, let me turn it over to John, and then we'll get back to Ron. Let me also say we've got 20 minutes left, and I know we've got about 8 hours worth of questions and comments, so we'll try to keep it as short as we can. I don't know how I'm going to moderate that, but I have to tell you, Rafe, and I think you know some of the people here. We've got such an amazing group of people on this call. You know, I hate to single out 2 or 3 because I don't want to slight anybody else, but people like Stephen Salter from Edinburgh in terms of marine cloud brightening, and Leslie Field, who's with the Arctic Ice Project. I mean, really world leaders. And I just want you to know, I guess my frustration and also hope is that with the kind of visionary spirit of and ambition and actual achievement of so many people that are here today and are otherwise involved, we've just got to figure out a way how to channel this in a productive way. So sorry for that 30-second rant. Let me turn it over to John.
When I started looking into this, the methane seemed to be the most obvious thing to worry about in the Arctic. And then it seemed to be sea level. And then I heard about this influence of the Arctic warming on the jet stream and the gradient, which you say has been known for decades, but I didn't know it. Jennifer Francis was my mentor on that. And the attention of sea level has not been great. The international attention on methane is growing a bit, but not great. But the effect of the jet stream, the growth in extreme weather events, that's really hitting home. And people, my son, who's thought that geoengineering was one of my mad ideas, has changed his mind due to living in the Northwest Pacific region of North America. He's quite worried about the climate, the actual climate changing. When these weather extremes happen regularly, it changes the climate. So is that the best thing to major on now? Is that the IPCC doesn't have an answer to it? Yeah.
In the IPCC, the people who invented overshoot. Overshoot means failure, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It means you're exceeding your goal, but you call it overshoot. So I thought that was pretty clever, actually. I just want to say something about your son. I think there's a lot of people changing their mind about this. If you let me just say, one possible organizational focus could be to say that geoengineering has to be part of the policy mix. That's all you do.
Hmm.
You say to John Kerry, you say to the media, you have press conferences. We have to do this. Here's why. We have to look at this. It's no longer viable to keep this in the closet because of the politics. Mike McCracken says, he just said, he had a quote. He says, it's more risky not to do it than to do it. Or close, I get on the quote. But there you go. So I'm saying as this organizational strategy, you have to pick a focus. Okay?
I'm asking you whether you think that's a good focus, the weather extremes.
The weather extremes. Well, no, the weather extremes are getting plenty of attention. What's not getting attention is geoengineering as part of the mix.
But the cause of the climate extremes, you hardly get any mention that it's due to this Arctic gradient.
No, you get, yeah, but so what? You bring the Arctic role in. That doesn't get you the policy. I'm saying as a matter of tactical focus for the organization, what's badly needed is a public support for having geoengineering as a part of the policy mix. You could have, I could suggest that you invite, who am I thinking of?
How about Kelly Wanzer?
Correct. Thank you.
Okay.
But Kelly is deeply into the advocacy on research, and she's appropriately cautious because she knows how fraught the politics are. But you should hear from her, right, Gabby? What do you think?
Yeah, she's doing some very interesting work also to there was a youth event letter that she organized broadly on some of these topics. So definitely recommend.
Yeah, it's that youth, she understands the politics because the left kind of uses the youth as opposition to geoengineering. And she managed to organize kind of a counter view of that. You know what I mean? So, and if you want to talk about methane, of course, my colleague is Durwood Zelke, who has become this fantastic advocate for the, putting enormous energy on the methane thing. But so what I'm saying, in my experience, you want to have a strategic goal. What is it that you all want to make happen? And I'm just going to come back and say, all right, let's go on. Let's go on. And I have her email right here.
Great. And before I turn it over to Ron for a minute, one of the questions I wanted to make sure I got in, you started to address, which is if you could give us 2 or 3 or 4 names of people or organizations or institutions that would be strategic for us to make develop relationships with. You mentioned Kelly and that she was on our radar already. Are there other folks or institutes or
I would say
officials that come to mind?
Well, one person who immediately comes to mind is Doug McMartin, who's a professor at Cornell, who's a geoengineering researcher, does a lot of modeling. I like Doug because he speaks very clearly.
I'm in contact with him.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I may add a comment,
Bodansky.
Having worked on geoengineering, Steve and I, for about 11, 12 years, right? The reality is that all that we're proposing is still vaporware.
Wait, I'm not understanding you.
Just vaporware is when you're in the venture capital business, okay? you look at somebody's proposal and it says, it doesn't exist, show me. So we have never had proven yet that, the things of SRM are going to work, including, marine cloud brightening. We don't have a working system. And so I faced 4 weeks ago somebody that, is a board member of EDF, very much in favor of all this, okay? And I faced him actually 12 years ago, or actually more than that, when he didn't want to invest in our company, all right? It became a huge success. And he says, look, until you guys can prove that any of this works, none of the funds are going to open to you. You worked on this for 12 years. It's time to show that it works. And that's the only way that people are going to get there. Okay? And if you want to make a case, I tell you, you don't get with advocates. Everybody can be an advocate, whether he's competent or not. What you need to take is people that are respected in the scientific field. And you have some of them like Mike and all that stuff on there, right? And these people, look, if you look what happened historically, okay? When Roosevelt was approached by Einstein and Szilard, okay, he reacted because he knew these guys were credible, right? And and the only reason that they actually were credible because the Germans had just split the atom, right? So nobody, Biden isn't going to take this up and things like that. But the things for us, and I blame myself itself, I worked on this for 12 years, right? Is that we have to have proof of these systems that they actually can do it. I mean, we don't know what the climate is, but that they technically work before anybody is going to open his wallet. So I'm just relaying to you, to a guy that's been in the venture capitalist for 50 years and is very sympathetic to our cause. And he says, the best thing that you guys can do is get one of these systems working, okay? And then that will change things dramatically. That's my input for working on this at 12 years and facing this guy, 15 years ago when he didn't want to invest in our company.
Well,
and
if
that
you get,
changes everything. That changes everything. So we're making a 1,000 by 1,000 optical switch, right, with extraordinary characteristics. And nobody would believe that you could do that. And so we made a small switch, 4 by 4, that had those characteristics. And that opened the door. That's the way it goes in venture capital. That's the way it's going to go for somebody to open it.
My immediate thought is to have somebody on your team who is an expert in aerosols.
Well,
Stratospheric
we
aerosols.
are lots of experts in aerosols, but this is a different thing. These are aerosols that have been made that we launch from the ground. We don't know what they're going to do, if they're going to rise and all that kind of stuff. How they're going to react.
We already launch aerosols from the ground into the troposphere, and they provide a substantial cooling. And as we clean up the atmosphere, it gets warmer because the
aerosols are made under different circumstances than the ones of salt that we're trying to make. And if we can prove this, we will be in, if we actually had an experiment that worked, we will be in a much stronger position to go and say this works, So as a side effect, we went in and showed for David Keith that if you take calcium carbonate, it's probably very easy to disperse it, essentially, as single particles, in spite of what you would think. It was a very simple experiment. Now, what we're doing about the other stuff is, is much more difficult, essentially, and needs more money. But I'm telling you, that would give us extraordinary credibility once you have a system that actually makes them to the 15, salt particles per second, and it's shown that they lift and do the thing that you want to do.
I have an excellent tactic here, or an amusing one. Go after, what's his name? Tesla.
Elon Musk.
Go after Amazon. These guys who are sending spaceships, right? And you go after them and say, what are you doing sending spaceships when we got to prove that an intervention like aerosol loading in the stratosphere will cool the planet? You get with it. Give us the dough. We'll run the experiment. Anyway, I'm just carrying on here, but that's what occurred to me, is that we have this incredible waste of resources on the one side, and what you're saying is we need to run the experiments. Yeah, David Keith tried to run an experiment and he got hammered in Sweden, right? So,
Perfect.
yeah.
So
So,
the Australian government is going to be doing this, aren't they, Robert? I thought that was the thing that they are actually going to be.
Well, let me,
investing
if
in
I
this.
could, let me just bring it back. We only have a few minutes left. First of all, I appreciate your comments, Armand, and I hope you'll stay connected with us, and maybe we can talk in the future about how to do what you're saying, which is find ways to field test and make this stuff happen. Ron has been waiting very patiently as I keep pushing him away. I hope you will not become my permanent enemy for putting you off for all these minutes. But as long as you keep your comment short, only because of time or your question, go for it, Ron.
I beg to disagree with Armand. I mean, I think there have been, you know, there are lots of people working on different methods, and that's one of the things I wanted to point out. I mean, we have Stephen Salter here, we have Leslie Field, we have you know, people using mirrors. Ye Tao is in our group, but you know, various different methods, and you know, at least in terms of, you know, small scale results, they do appear to be effective. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm an economist, but you know, I think it's you know, it's a kind of a chicken and the egg thing. But on that point, you know, you get money to do the experiments. You know, anyway, I would like to push back a little bit. I mean, I think our group has been very, you know, deliberately very, you know, big tent oriented. That is, we welcome any method to cool. And our proposal has been, let's evaluate all these methods and, you know, see what works best, and probably use use different methods for, you know, the Arctic, for example, is a more localized, well, you know, relatively localized region. And perhaps, you know, we could do that with something like marine cloud brightening, or some, you know, or the ice pumps that Brian von Hertzen and Sev Clark have been proposing. To cool the Arctic. And, you know, even if you know, because the political constraints on SRM may be too great, or maybe we need SRM. I mean, I'm you know, I'm perfectly open to that. If so I think that's one point I just wanted to make. And the other is perhaps, Rafe, this letter that you're proposing, I mean, I think it's a great idea. I would wonder if, you know, you might be able to, because that's exactly the kind of thing, you know, we've been trying to find a point of leverage. How can we move this conversation, move this debate, get closer to where we want to be? You know, if you could help us with that, that would be great. I think, you know, we're at this point. I mean, I agree. I was in Tennessee during those tornadoes. I mean, I think we are at the point where people realize that the climate truly is breaking down right now in real time. And, you know, we have to do something. And I'm not sure SRM right away, but something to directly cool. I mean, that's the other thing, this idea that the disconnect between politicians continue to promote emissions reduction, which is great. They don't always achieve what they're talking about, but they use that as their sort of fig leaf for addressing climate change. And the connection with the fact that emissions reduction is not going to solve the climate catastrophe, at least for the next 30 years, at least. You know, it's not going to, you know, that's another point I think we would want to make in such a letter, that, you know, we're sort of barking up the wrong tree, at least in the short run.
I think what we tried to do in this op-ed, we'll have a look, is got a big tent approach to interventions. You create a division of DARPA or ARPA-E for climate interventions, and you evaluate them all on an urgent basis. You know, somebody's talking about, well, they came to Roosevelt and, you know, the Germans had split the atom or something. This is on the level of urgency as the Manhattan Project. That's what's becoming clear, right?
That's, you know, it's very interesting. Excuse me, you say that about creating it's an institute like that, because here in Montgomery County, where a couple of us are, I proposed several years ago that the county work with Jamie Raskin, our congressman, and others to create to establish a National Institute of Climate to be located here, because we've got so many other institutions. NOAA is literally a 5-minute walk from where I sit now. So maybe if you guys think that makes some sense, Rafe and Mike, we could talk about that separately, because Jamie had some positive response to that. Though he said it was during the Trump administration. He said he was afraid of putting a lot of climate programs in one agency because then it would be an easier target for Trump to X them all out, which is a pretty sad reason not to support something, but probably a pretty understandable one. So, but before we wrap up, I know Clive has had your hand up for quite a while. Go for it, Clive.
I mean, this group seems to be doing all the right things. So it's just a question of, you know, how it seems to me there's no doubt hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people around the world kind of quietly going nuts with all this. But so there needs to be this sort of organized effort like this. Maybe joining up with the people that go and sit in the street in Britain. We have Extinction Rebellion, and they just say, do something. They have no idea what should be done. So I suggested, I don't like to do the wrong thing. So it's just a kind of, I don't know, flying a kite kind of thing. Saying that, because there's people talking about these tsunamis starting to happen with the ice coming from Greenland suddenly disgorging, and it might get worse, and there might be there's some sort of talk that might move a boulder onto the, you know, enormous flooding happening, and naval bases will get swamped. I read that several years ago, Norfolk, Virginia, I don't know much about the US naval bases, but I heard that's going underwater. There was some video about it. People can't get to work because the road's underwater in the naval base. And maybe that's a political, you know, angle. So, you know, how are we going to defend ourselves if we can't even maintain ships at least in that naval base? So that's it, really. I mean, I don't want to take up everyone's time. It's great to see so many faces that on the emails, and basically I'm there with you folks. And any response from Rafe? Great to meet you, Rafe.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to meet everybody here, except for Mike, because I already knew him.
Well, let me. We're at 46 minutes after the hour, according to my computer clock, and I certainly don't want to ask Rafe to stay any longer. But I know I speak for everybody when I give you my, you know, deepest satisfaction and appreciation for all the work you've done all these decades. And though no one has mentioned it, you know, if you want to learn more about Rafe, and that New York Times article that was published 4 years ago in their magazine is an extraordinary article, and I commend everybody to take a look at it. You know, and we're heartened that it sounds like you're willing to stay connected with us as we move forward. Come back, give us some advice, give us some email addresses or whatever it may be. When I was watching your video on YouTube, with your conversation with Hugh Hunt of the Center for the Climate Repair, a group obviously it also has the same, you know, kind of triad approach, and that, you know, that we hope to work more closely with. I remember at the end they invited you out to dinner in Cambridge, I guess it was, right, 3 years ago. And unfortunately on Zoom I can't do the same here, but since you and Mike are not far, maybe at some point, COVID permitting, at least the three of us and anybody else who would like to join us can meet in person. But in the meantime, Rafe, I'll just give you any last a minute or so to any kind of wrap up thoughts, suggestions, or whatever, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm happy to keep talking. I really appreciate the chance to share ideas with everybody. I applaud what you're doing. Just let me know if you want to continue to talk, and I'm happy to do that.
All right. Well, again, on behalf of all of us, our thanks and our appreciation for your career and your work and your wit tonight. Thanks, everybody. Have a good holiday.